also on behalf of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. That was created about 18 years ago by my uncle and his good friend Jack Mandelbaum in the Kansas City area. And what happened was one day Jack was out in his yard doing yard work, and his friend was out in the yard, and they started talking, and the friend said, well, Jack, I know you were in the concentration camps. What kind of sports did you play in the camps? Well, you can imagine he was mortified, but it got him to start thinking about, here's my neighbor, educated person, and he was totally clueless as to what happened during World War II. So he and my uncle decided to create an organization that would educate. And our main focus is going into schools, but we also speak to organizations and anybody who asks us to speak. And I started speaking just a few years ago as a second generation because I felt it was extremely important to carry the story on now that so many of the survivors are no longer with us, and especially my parents. My father passed away almost 25 years ago, and he was a survivor as well. But today I'm going to tell the story of my mother, who, by the way, is the only one in the Kansas City, the only survivor in the Kansas City area who is out speaking. So before I start my presentation, I'd like to start with a little bit of history. On April 14th, 1945, elements of the United States Army's 89th Infantry Division and the 49th Armored Division captured the Ohrdruf concentration camp, south central Germany. When General Eisenhower learned about the camp, he immediately arranged to meet Generals Bradley and Patton at Ohrdruf on the morning of April 12th. By that time, Buchenwald itself had been captured. Consequently, Ike decided to extend the group's visit to include a tour of the Buchenwald concentration camp the next day. Eisenhower also ordered every American soldier in the area who was not on the front lines to visit Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. He wanted them to see for themselves what they were fighting against. During the camp inspections with his top commanders, Eisenhower said that the atrocities were, and I quote, beyond the American mind to comprehend. He ordered that every citizen of the town of Gotha personally tour the camp, and after having done so, the mayor and his wife went home and hanged themselves. Later on, Ike wrote to Mamie, I never dreamed that such cruelty, bestiality, and savagery could really exist in this world. He cabled General Marshall to suggest that he come to Germany and see these camps for himself. He encouraged Marshall to bring congressmen and journalists with him. It would be many months before the world will know the full scope of the Holocaust. Many months before they knew that the Nazi murder apparatus that was being discovered at Buchenwald and dozens of other death camps had slaughtered millions of innocent people. General Eisenhower understood that many people would be unable to comprehend the full scope of this horror. He also understood that any human deeds that were so utterly evil might eventually be challenged or even denied as being literally unbelievable. For these reasons, he ordered that all the civilian news media and military combat camera units be requested to visit the camps and record their observations in print, pictures, and film. As he explained to General Marshall, I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. His prediction proved correct. When some groups, even today, attempt to deny that the Holocaust ever happened, they must confront the massive official record, including both written evidence and thousands of pictures that Eisenhower ordered to be assembled when he saw what the Nazis had done. And as an added note to that, there are a couple of taped interviews that you'll be seeing that was done through Steven Spielberg's Shoah Project, which he created about 1995. He did it for 5 years. When he was filming his movie in Poland, Schindler's List, he had somebody come up to him who was a witness and wanted to tell their story. And he didn't have the time, he wasn't able to spend time with this person. He came back to the States and he started to think about, oh my gosh, I didn't have the opportunity to record him. And then he started to think there are thousands of other stories out there that need to be heard. So he started this project, and for 5 years he had trained people go around the world recording. So now we have even more and more thousands of witnesses that have been recorded and archived. So with that, and also any of the photos that you see here, the family photos that you'll see of my mother's family, the only reason they survived was because she had a handful of relatives who left before the Nazis took over and went to South America. So if they hadn't kept those photos, she wouldn't have anything of her family, and the majority of survivors did not have any pictures of their family after the war. So with that, we'll start my mother's story. So my mother was born on November 10th, 1925, in a small town in Poland called Mizrich. Her hometown was very well known for the production of brushes and furs. And according to my mother, the residents referred to their community as Little America, since it was so thriving and productive. And so her small town was on the eastern part of Poland. And this is an actual photo of what her town looked like when she was living there. There's the center of town, and that's the synagogue below. This is a picture, circle picture here down here is my mother's brother. And this was a youth group that he belonged to, so I don't know anybody in that picture except for him. And up here is my mother, and there is her sister. And in this whole photo are her aunts, uncles, cousins, distant relatives, extended relatives. And the only two people who survived the war was my mother and her sister. So here again is the synagogue before the war. Here it is, what remained after the war. And so this is my mother's father, and he was in the Polish army. We're not exactly sure if he actually fought while he was in the army, but he was in the army. And he was a furrier. And this is an interesting photo because this is my mother's mother and father, and in the middle here was my aunt, and a photo of my aunt. But she had the picture in the bottom of her shoe. And over a period of time, her image was totally rubbed out. And so this is more of my mother's extended family, and none of them survived the war. In 1939, the beginning of World War II, life changed for my mother's family and her community. First, the German army took over Mizrich. Then, German SS troops entered and imposed restrictions on all Jews. They had to wear a yellow Jewish star in their arms at all times. They had a curfew and were not allowed to attend school. They were no longer allowed to walk on the sidewalks, instead being forced to walk in the gutters. The SS confiscated my grandfather's fur business and my great-grandmother's restaurant. My mother's family was forced to leave their home and move into her grandmother's house. Her father and brother were sent to work in labor camps. When winter arrived, they were sent back home. After living with grandmother, they were forced to move into a one-room apartment with a very small kitchen in a part of town where all the Jews of Mizrich were ordered to live. This was the Mizrich ghetto. And you can see the fence separating the Jews from the rest of the population. And this is an actual picture of her ghetto. After living there for a short time, they moved again. This time their living quarters consisted of one room. My grandfather, who was somehow able to get a work permit for my mother's brother, which allowed him to work for an engineer and live outside the ghetto. Life in the ghetto was, as you all know, very difficult. People were forced to live in overcrowded apartments without privacy, water, and sanitation. My mother's family carried water from the wells in the streets. There were no bathrooms. Food was scarce and rations were dispensed. People had to stand in line daily to receive a small amount of bread. Every day, people were dying of starvation and illness. As time went on, living conditions worsened, and the ghetto became more and more crowded, with Jews being transported from other towns to live in the Mizrich ghetto. During this period of time, my mother, who was 15, and her father were allowed to work at the brush workshop, making brushes for the Germans without pay. They felt they were extremely lucky because as long as they could work in this brush workshop, they would not be sent to a concentration camp. They lived in constant fear. The SS was frequently rounding up people in the ghetto, marching them to the train station, putting them on cattle cars to be sent to the concentration camps. In the small room where they lived, my grandfather created a hiding place underneath the floorboards. When they heard the Germans rounding people up, banging on doors, yelling for everyone to come out, they would hide under the floor. In 1943, the Germans closed down the brush workshop, and that same year, in the month of May, the SS stormed her apartment building and searched the room where she and her family were living. They were hiding under the floor, but this time the soldier brought German shepherds that sniffed them out. Once again, all of these photos were taken in Mizrich. This was one of the deportations. I have no idea if my mother was part of this particular deportation, but this is what happened. They'd bring them out, force them down on their hands and knees. They were dragged outside and were told to kneel while others were being rounded up. My mother was certain she and her family were going to be shot dead. My mother's younger sister became hysterical, and somehow, while the guard wasn't looking, my grandfather grabbed her and escaped. So here they are marching towards the train station with the guards. And here again, and here they are being put on the cattle cars. After thousands of people were forced out of the ghettos and gathered into the same area where my mother was, the group was given the command to march to train station. The guards wanted them to move faster, so they were forced to run until they reached the station, which was about 2 to 3 miles away. When they arrived, the SS made them get into cattle cars. They shoved as many people as possible into the train cars that had one small window opening at the top. According to my mother, who was 17 at the time, they were literally packed in like sardines. Everyone standing, squeezed in together. It was the month of May, and it was very warm, and of course, with just one small window in the cattle car, there was no air circulation. The train left in the daytime and arrived to its destination the next day. They did not stop the train to allow people to relieve themselves or to get fresh air. On this car, a few people she knew were able to pry the doors open and jump. My mother said she'd jump too, but my grandmother wouldn't do it. My mother would not leave her mother behind, and her friend who jumped was shot dead. However, there were others who jumped and were able to survive the war in the forest, and my aunt, who escaped with my grandfather, survived in the forest, and she has a whole other story. But my grandfather and my uncle went into hiding, and one of the Polish people told the Nazis where they were, and they took them out of the house and shot them dead. So we're on the train, and at some point in the middle of the night, the train stopped briefly in a small town. By then, some people in the cattle car had collapsed, and some were dead. The doors were not opened, and everyone, of course, was extremely thirsty. My mother climbed on top of dead bodies to hand money to a villager through the small window for a canteen of water. When the canteen was handed to her, she got a drink and was going to hand it to her mother, but too many people were grabbing for it, taking it from her. This train was headed for the Treblinka death camp, but as it approached the camp, it was sent to a different camp. And I don't know if you know, but Treblinka was a death camp that it was created solely, I mean, all the camps were created to murder the Jews, but this one solely, there was no labor camp associated with it. So the minute you got off the train, you were sent to the gas chambers. by the time my mother's train got there, they couldn't process the people in the trains fast enough. So they turned her train around and they sent her to Majdanek. So here's another close-up of the people being put on the trains. So she continued on to Majdanek. When the doors of her cattle car opened, the SS were waiting for them. As they got off the car, each person was directed to go either to the left or the right. Fortunately for my mother and grandmother, they were directed to go to the right. If you were sent to the left, you were on your way to die in the gas chambers. My mother's group was then marched to the shower, where they disrobed, showered, and were given old clothes to wear. The next stop was placing them in their barracks, which had straw bags for mattresses. There were no latrines at this camp, just deep holes that had been dug up. My mother and grandmother spent 6 months in Majdanek. Every day started at 5 a.m. with everyone standing at attention for a roll call. Then they were marched out to the fields where they worked and planted vegetables. They used the human feces that filled the latrine holes to fertilize the fields. People were whipped, beaten, or attacked by German Shepherd dogs if they didn't obey or work hard enough or just did something that displeased the guards. My mother witnessed people being thrown into the latrine pits where they drowned to death. And this is the chimney of the crematorium. And you can see the city of Lublin in the back. So it had to be pretty obvious to everybody what was going on. Most of these camps were close to cities. They weren't out in the middle of nowhere. Also on behalf of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. That was created about 18 years ago by my uncle and his good friend Jack Mandelbaum in the Kansas City area. And what happened was one day Jack was out in his yard doing yard work, and his friend was out in the yard, and they started talking, and the friend said, well, Jack, I know you were in the concentration camps. What kind of sports did you play in the camps? Well, you can imagine, he was mortified, but it got him to start thinking about. Immediately arranged to meet Generals Bradley and Patton at Ohrdruf on the morning of April 12th. By that time, Buchenwald itself had been captured. Consequently, Ike decided to extend the group's visit to include a tour of the Buchenwald concentration camp the next day. Eisenhower also ordered every American soldier in the area who was not on the front lines to visit Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. He wanted them to see for themselves what they were fighting against. During the camp inspections with his top commanders, Eisenhower said that the atrocities were, and I quote, beyond the American mind to comprehend. He ordered that every citizen of the town of Gotha personally tour the camp, and after having done so, the mayor and his wife went home and hanged themselves. Later on, Ike wrote to Mamie, I never dreamed that such cruelty, bestiality, and savagery could really exist in this world. He cabled General Marshall to suggest that he come to Germany and see these camps for himself. He encouraged Marshall to bring congressmen, and he was a survivor as well. But today I'm going to tell the story of my mother, who, by the way, is the only one in the Kansas City, the only survivor in the Kansas City area who is out speaking. So before I start my presentation, I'd like to start with a little bit of history. On April 14th, 1945, elements of the United States Army's 89th Infantry Division and the 49th Armored Division captured the Ohrdruf concentration camp, south central Germany. When General Eisenhower learned about the camp, he immediately, here's my neighbor, educated person, and he was totally clueless as to what happened during World War II. So he and my uncle decided to create an organization that would educate And our main focus is going into schools, but we also speak to organizations and anybody who asks us to speak. And I started speaking just a few years ago as a second generation because I felt it was extremely important to carry the story on now that so many of the survivors are no longer with us, and especially my parents. My father passed away almost 25 years ago.